Donald Trump's second term is more radical than his first. He's shaking up America and creating huge uncertainty for the world. Trump is redefining America's goals, its relationships, its whole place in the world. He's pressuring friends and reaching out to adversaries. This is making people everywhere wonder, what's next? Are we next? What is his plan? Trump can seem so unpredictable, so impulsive, that many assume there is no plan, no roadmap, no strategy. But it might not be that simple. In fact, plenty of what Trump is doing aligns with established strategic ideas. Ideas that could help us understand what he's doing and anticipate what might come next. Well, that's what this video is all about. We're going to take a detailed look at 3 theories that are out there. First, realism, that Trump is embracing a foreign policy vision based not on principles, but on power. Second, the reverse Kissinger, that Trump is trying to repeat a coup of 20th century Cold War diplomacy, at least its mirror image. And third, spheres of influence, that Trump is seeking a world where great powers openly dominate their backyards. Any of these strategies would have historic implications for the world. So we're going to work through them one at a time, unpacking the logic and looking at evidence that they are part of Trump's plan. A historian of US foreign policy will break these ideas down for us through a high-level strategic lens.
What are America's vital interests in the world, and what kinds of military deployments and alliance commitments should the United States make to secure those vital interests?
And experts on Europe, Russia, China, and India will spell out the potential implications in critical regions, both risks and opportunities.
I think this disruption was necessary.
The ashes of disruption, something new can be built.
I think Taiwan has been pretty anxious.
It's very risky, dangerous, and increasingly unpredictable.
Before we get started, I want to give you a heads up about a few things. First of all, this is not a Trump bashing exercise, nor is it about sugarcoating anything. You're going to hear critical and supportive voices. Second, these are still early days, and other issues from trade wars to domestic politics are also in the mix. In this video, though, we have a tight focus on foreign policy strategy. And third, our discussion will involve extrapolation from current evidence. Things will change. This is about a longer view, not about individual events. What we hope is that by the end of this video, you'll have more of a sense of where Trump could be heading, ways to interpret the actions that he takes, what strategy they might fit into, their chances of success or failure, and what that would mean for all of us. Okay, let's go.
You have to be thankful. You don't have the cards. You're buried there, your people are dying.
Remember this, the meltdown between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House. Strip away the rage, and we find pointers here about our first theory, that Trump is a realist.
A realist approach to the war in Ukraine would try to get the war to conclude through a compromise on both sides, sooner rather than later.
Stephen Wertheim is an expert on realism. This is how he defines it.
Well, realism for international relations scholars and practitioners is an orientation toward foreign policy that says that states do and should pursue their concrete national interests in a fairly hard-headed way.
You'd be a tough guy.
Back in the Oval Office, hard-headed sounds about right.
But you're either going to make a deal or we're out. And if we're out, you'll fight it out. I don't think it's going to be pretty, but you'll fight it out. But you don't have the cards.
It can be opposed to idealism, the idea that the pursuit of values should guide foreign policy, or in fact will guide states' conduct.
Realism versus idealism, power versus principles. Let's look at that for a moment with one of Joe Biden's appearances with Zelensky.
No nation can be truly secure in the world if, in fact, we don't stand up and defend the freedom of Ukraine from the face of this Russian brutality and aggression.
And back to Donald Trump.
I don't think you'd be a tough guy without the United States.
Back to Biden.
We supported just and lasting peace, one that respects Ukrainian sovereignty and its territorial integrity.
And back to Trump.
And as you know, our country doesn't have much raw earth, so we're going to be using it for all of the things we do.
So really big shift there from Biden to Trump, from rhetoric based on principles and justice to judgments of power and advantage. Now let's zoom out from this shift on Ukraine to a wider worldview.
A realist critique would be that President Biden leaned too hard into the idea that the United States should lead a rules-based international order, that it should frame foreign policy in terms of a struggle between democracy and autocracy. President Trump portrays other countries and perhaps the international order as a whole as having been to the detriment of the United States, as having perhaps even exploited the United States over at least the past several decades.
The shockwaves are being felt all over the world.
There is an implosion of the international rules-based order.
Gautam Chikermane is vice president of India's most prominent foreign policy think tank, the ORF. He says this order was already crumbling.
Until yesterday, there were two orders. One was the one that did not follow the rules, which is China or to some extent Russia. America and EU were supposed to be the creators and the followers of the rules-based order. Europe looks like jokers to us. And they talk about values, but they pursue their interests.
Now, Trump's skepticism could deal a fatal blow.
In his second term, it seems that he is giving up on the rules-based order and saying that if the rules are not being followed, why should America alone follow the rules?
This is, of course, one of the cornerstones of Trump's whole political platform, that America comes first.
During every single day of the Trump administration, I will very simply put America first.
America First has its own heritage and US political thinking, going back to the isolationists of the last century. They went beyond realism with a desire to keep the US out of foreign entanglements entirely. Some have called Trump an isolationist. At the minimum, you can see a family resemblance between these ideas.
America First does lean in a realist direction. It's certainly not an idealistic cast of mind.
For many around the world, this is more honest than Trump's predecessors.
America First has always been America's grand strategy. He has just brought it out in the open. It's no longer covert, secret, implied. This is overt, in your face, unabashed, unapologetic.
And to be clear, Joe Biden's approach to the war in Ukraine was not all about defending democracy. It also pursued its own view of US interests.
There's also some criticism that one can make towards the approach that the Biden administration has pursued towards Europe and towards Ukraine in the past, which was basically not focused on ending the war in Ukraine and reaching an end state.
Liana Fix is a German foreign policy analyst at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's in Washington, D.C.
Based on the assumption that ending this war wasn't necessarily fully in the US interest, not a priority interest, because this war led to a diminishment of Russian power in Europe.
Now Trump is turning that on its head.
He sees himself in a neutral role, and his primary aim is to get into a working relationship, to a normalization of relations with Russia.
Trump gave javelins.
And for Liana Fix, this involves Trump's own brand of realism.
Let me tell you, you don't have the cards.
I would say Donald Trump is a realist businessman, but that's different than a traditional realists who see the world just through the lens of measuring nuclear power, measuring military power, measuring economic power. That's not Trump per se. That's not where his thinking comes from. He wants to reset relations because he thinks he can do deals with Russia, he can do business deals with Russia, and he doesn't care whether Russia acts as the aggressor or not.
This is a dramatic pivot from an approach that's ostensibly based on principles, yet also aimed at weakening Russia, to an approach that rejects principles as irrelevant and sets a goal of getting on with Russia. Here in Europe, the consequences are profound.
So Europe has perceived itself so far as the last island of multilateralism, of the rules-based order, which is a comfortable and cozy and warm position, fuzzy position to have, but it doesn't help you in a time when power is really defined through military power.
You see the impact in Germany, where a new leadership has brought in a dramatic plan to build up its military.
Europe is in the fundamental dilemma that it only has two choices. Either it rearms and buys enough time for this rearmament, which will not be done by tomorrow, continuing US protection during that time, or it opts for an implicit appeasement of Russia.
That US protection might not continue for long. Consider what realists think about NATO.
Realists have tended to be critics of NATO enlargement from the beginning of the process after the Cold War.
That process brought in the Baltic states, which are now seen as most exposed to a potential Russian attack.
I think that President Trump would probably be reluctant to fight for the Baltics if that means engaging in full-scale warfare with Russia. The United States, when it committed to, on paper, defend the Baltic states, was not thinking that that commitment might actually come due. So we should all be concerned about this problem from a structural perspective. It's not just an oddity of President Trump.
So Europe is now facing the possibility of having to defend the Baltics without US support. Early on, Trump's team also ruled out enlarging NATO further to include Ukraine. And Vice President J.D. Vance came to Germany to deliver a further shock for the Europeans that was, if anything, deeper. We were there.
J.D. Vance just gave a speech here at the Munich Security Conference, and it was wild.
Vance's address was a full-throated attack on European democracy, and it raised the prospect of a really profound rift between America and Europe. Now jolted into action, the European Union is urging all its members to rearm.
I thought Europe was going to continue to drift in its strategic slumber, but suddenly it seems to have woken up. If Europe can get together by this and take care of its own security, I think Trump would have achieved far more than he ever could on any other parameter. I think Europe was drifting, and I think this shock was necessary.
But others argue that if shock treatment has been Trump's goal, he's overshot the mark and gone beyond what realism can explain.
This is going to be great television, I will say that.
Sometimes what President Trump pursues is maybe less tied to concrete gains or losses for the United States than how it affects the narrative of President Trump's position on the world stage. And that can take the president in maybe a non-realist direction.
I think that Trump is coming from a realist place with a caveat.
Alexander Gabuev is an expert on Russia and China based in Berlin.
It's clear that the US alliance network is what makes the US the predominant player in the global system. And this is an asset that no other peer competitor, be it China, or adversary, be it Russia, nobody can match that. And the most unrealist part of Trump's foreign policy course is the heavy blow that he has delivered to this very network of allies.
So it's clear that realism is not the whole story. There's more going on. So let's get to our second theory, one that suggests a much bigger plan, not focused on America's allies, but on its two biggest rivals. It's February 1972. US President Richard Nixon lands in Beijing on a trip that would change the world. The motorcade sweeps through the city, giving Nixon's team glimpses not just of Chairman Mao, but of Lenin and Stalin adorning Tiananmen Square. This trip was about establishing relations with Mao to draw him away from those Soviet connections. And it worked. It was a coup of Cold War diplomacy, pulled off by Nixon's legendary strategist, Henry Kissinger. Fast forward to October 2024. Donald Trump is holding one of his last pre-election rallies with the media personality Tucker Carlson. As they near the end, Trump gets onto geopolitics.
We are a nation in very serious decline, and look at what these stupid people have done. They've allowed Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and others to get together in a group. Biden united them. It's a shame. The stupidity of what they've done. Well, I'm going to have to ununite them, and I think I can do that too. I have to ununite them.
Ununiting Russia and China. It's actually an idea that's been floating around for years. That under Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, Moscow and Beijing have become dangerously close. And that the smart play for the US right now is to try to pull them apart. It's a move that would carry strong vibes of that Nixon-Kissinger coup of the 1970s. But in today's world, it would be in reverse.
There's a lot of talk of a reverse Kissinger. This time, the overture would be to Moscow to move it away from its alignment with the People's Republic of China.
Under Putin and Xi, Russia and China are deeply intertwined, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. It's a relationship built on the two leaders' shared antagonism towards the US.
So a reverse Kissinger, I think, could take two different forms. First, it could be a really ambitious attempt to break the strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing, to bring Russia over to the side of the West, or at least the United States.
But this first idea might be a stretch for a number of reasons.
There are limits to the historical analogy. The context is just not the same.
Amanda Hsiao is director for China and Taiwan at the Eurasia Group consultancy.
Nixon was able to arrive at a rapprochement with China in the 70s and distance Beijing from Moscow because there were already problems in the Sino-Soviet relationship. And that's not the situation today. Russia is relatively dependent on China in terms of security and economically.
Neither Russia nor China want to go back into confrontation mode, and this puts limitations to how much dent you can create between Russia and China.
So how much of a dent might be possible?
More modestly, a reverse Kissinger could entail giving Russia more options, making it less dependent on China for the long term, and therefore limiting what a more robust Russia-China partnership might do in the future. And I suspect that it's that latter form of thinking that is informing the current administration more than the idea of being able to peel Moscow completely away from China.
Let's dig into this. If the Trump administration really means to attempt this, it'll have to be highly attuned to the risk of getting played. The Russians are ready.
They've seen attempts to drive a wedge between Russia and China for a number of years now, including from Trump's administration. They are not very happy about their level of dependence on China, but they have much more trust in China than they have in the US.
Previous US attempts to reach out to Russia are widely seen as failures. Most famously, the Obama-era reset, complete with a physical prop for the top diplomats. 5 years later, Russia seized Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. In 2021, Joe Biden tried to stabilize things with the presidential summit. Just 8 months after that, Vladimir Putin ordered his troops into the rest of Ukraine.
So the risks of failure are significant. Alexander Gabuev watches Putin and Xi Jinping closely. He takes us through the considerations for the players involved. First of all, the Americans.
The US needs to be very clear-eyed of what elements of China-Russia axis is it most concerned about, and what can it do about that. And probably you would rank the intelligence sharing, sharing of weapon designs, military cooperation, all of this exercises that are stepped up in terms of size and in the signaling towards the US allies, like the strategic patrols of nuclear-armed bombers.
This military cooperation has been one of the most worrying elements of the China-Russia partnership for the US. But what could the Americans do? Alexander Gabuev spells out their potential next moves.
Then you would try to offer Russia incentives. And you can probably say, hey, China is a towering presence in your economy, so why don't we provide incentives to gradually undo the sanctions regime and help you to restore your economic ties with the Europeans, bring back some American investment.
Let's go to the next player, Vladimir Putin. What will his calculations be? He's certainly aware that Russia's relationship with China isn't exactly equal.
Longer term, the more leverage China has, the more it's likely to exploit that and to cut deals with Russia that are favoring China more than that are favoring Russia. And with that, some breathing space is something that you want to have.
Trump's approach could look like providing exactly that for Russia, breathing space. And Putin could make some enticing offers of his own in return.
You can offer an idea of partnership where Russia and the US could work together on some of the international crises that the US deems important, like be it Houthis, be it Iran. You can contribute to control over nuclear weapons, and then you can do very basic economic deals. And the obstacle to that are the US sanctions that need to be dismantled.
For Putin, this could be a rich opportunity.
I think that Vladimir Putin sees Donald Trump as a gift that keeps on giving. And if Trump is ready to offer carrots, you would just dangle this ability to do reverse Kissinger in front of Trump's nose. You will pocket all the carrots that are coming your way. And if your major obsession are the adversaries in the West, if that's your worldview, then the detrimental blow that Donald Trump delivers to the transatlantic unity over Russia is definitely a gift that you want to pocket. And then you see Trump as not only realist, but also very transactional, with short attention span, who is ready to break the rules, who is seeking short-term profit and seeking various deals, including commercial deals, including deals with people close to him.
And underlying all of this, Putin's bet that Xi Jinping remains his crucial partner in the long run.
He will also find a way to talk to the Chinese, saying, hey, Trump is offering us these things. We are willing to entertain this opportunity because we know that Trump is there for 4 years. He is out of the picture, so we are absolutely not interested in rocking the boat of our bilateral relationship with you, China. So let's think how both of us can play Trump. And what are the symbolic concessions that we can offer to Trump that he is under the impression that, oh, our relationship is eroding, while in reality will only fortify and solidify our bond.
Those apparent concessions could involve the things we heard about earlier.
So, for example, why don't we cancel this symbolic flights of nuclear-armed bombers, right? They don't bring that much to the table, frankly. We will cancel that, we'll make a big fuss, and then Trump will think that he is policy is working. Why don't we kind of reduce the scale of the mutual military exercise for the next 4 years, while at the same time we will fortify the economic conditions?
But there is at least one area where the US and Russia could work towards something meaningful.
I do think President Trump is genuinely concerned about the possibility of nuclear war. It's a frequent topic that he returns to.
The last treaty regulating US and Russian nuclear weapons expires in 2026. It was the most positive outcome of Obama's reset. Renewing it could bring benefits to both sides.
I think that the Russians are interested. The Russians will be happily going into that direction because they are embarking on a costly military modernization. They want to expand their conventional military, compensate for losses of equipment in Ukraine. So if there is a way to avoid a nuclear arms race with the US, the Russians will be happily doing that. The question is that Trump really wants to bring China into this conversation, and the Russians understand that China is absolutely not interested before it reaches the same level of of nuclear deterrent as the Americans and the Russians.
So there's a major China angle in the nuclear weapons issue too. Let's take a look now at China's calculations if it sees Russia and the US starting to get along. Would Xi Jinping really have no concerns?
Likely there is some uncertainty and sensitivity and anticipation of a shift in dynamic between Beijing and Moscow as a result of improvements in the US-Russian relationship. You know, Putin will have more leverage in its dealings with Beijing in a scenario where sanctions on Russia are lifted.
But for Xi, that does not change the really big picture, China's own highest level strategy.
Its alignment with Russia is strategic and not tactical. And as long as that condition holds, that competition with the US will continue, and that Beijing views Washington as its primary and long-term adversary.
So we've seen a significant number of dangers for the US around even this limited idea of a reverse Kissinger. But the potential upsides are clear too. So what would it mean for other global players? For some, improving US-Russia relations would be welcome in its own right, like in India, which has strong ties with both Washington and Moscow.
It would be wonderful if US and Russia get together, because India and Russia are already there together. I think the days of binaries are over. I think if Russia and America do get closer, it doesn't mean it will be at the cost of Russia and China. If India and America get closer, it will not be at the cost of India and Russia.
But back in Europe, the US getting meaningfully closer to Russia would compound the shock to the system that we heard about in part 1. And the prospect is feeding the idea that Europe might want to stabilize ties with China to hedge its geopolitical bets. This would certainly be an opportunity for Beijing, which has long aimed for its own geopolitical coup to split Europe from America.
China sees both challenges and opportunities in the geopolitical shifts that are occurring right now. And so I think from the Chinese perspective, even if there is some anxiety about the China-Russian relationship, they see potential for gain in the European one.
But for Europeans, there are warnings against going down this road.
I think that would be a naive illusion from Europeans. China is both an economic and a security threat to Europeans.
The fact that these discussions are happening shows the degree of disruption that even this modest version of a reverse Kissinger could bring. But Trump and his administration could believe that it's worth it.
We do have a team of national security advisors around him who know that there is a danger in an axis of upheaval, as it is called, in closer relations between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea that is detrimental to US interest.
There's the possibility that in the future, if the partnership among these four countries gets closer, they could launch attacks that are coordinated.
That is the nightmare scenario for the US. It's a key part of why the administration wants Europe to take more responsibility for its security.
The fear that the US might be overstretched in a two-front war in Europe and the Indo-Pacific is a real and a legitimate fear that US defense planners have, and something that Europeans have to take into account.
The Biden administration's approach to this threat was closing ranks with allies. Trump's appears to be the opposite, reaching out to Russia to try to splinter the threat. But there's another idea, that Trump might want to go a step further to defuse that threat altogether. It's the third theory in this video, and potentially it's the most disruptive of all. Let's get to it. January 2025, another presidential plane touches down in a foreign land. They call this one Trump Force One, an unofficial plane for an unofficial trip before Trump's inauguration. In fact, there's no president on board. Instead, Donald Trump Jr. arrives with a message from his father.
He says hello. We were talking to him yesterday, so he says hello to everyone in Greenland.
Okay, are you still using the car?
2 months later, Trump Sr. is now in office, making his first address to Congress, with more to say to Greenland, a little clearer now.
And I also have a message tonight for the incredible people of Greenland. We strongly support your right to determine your own future. And if you choose, we welcome you into the United States of America.
What might sound at first like a friendly invitation, even something comical, then takes a turn.
We need Greenland for national security and even international security, and we're working with everybody involved to try and get it. But we need it really for international world security, and I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
This was extraordinary. A US president talking about getting a huge swathe of foreign land, one way or the other. Within the month, Vice President J.D. Vance was visiting troops in Greenland and promoting a video suggesting that an American takeover was inevitable.
This is not just history, it is destiny. Now is the time to stand together again. For peace, for security, for the future, America stands with Greenland.
You look at how beautiful
Trump has put similar pressure on Canada.
But if you look at Canada, it would be cherished as a 51st state. They don't pay their share of military in NATO. They pay very little for military. They're not protected at all. And the reason is they think we're going to protect them. Without the U.S., Canada really doesn't have a country.
And he set his sights on the Panama Canal, a crucial trading route.
The Panama Canal was built by Americans for Americans, not for others. But others could use it. We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
It's as if Trump wants to take control of America's backyard. What is this? Well, this idea has a long heritage, that powerful countries should have a sphere of influence.
Spheres of influence are associated with great power relations and empire from the 19th century into the 20th century. One idea of spheres of influence is that almost inevitably major powers exert predominant political influence among weaker neighbors. There's no question that President Trump is employing spheres of influence thinking when he threatens to annex the Panama Canal, Greenland, or Canada.
Trump's inaugural address also carried elements of this thinking.
The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars.
President Trump explicitly referred to America's 19th century tradition of manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny. That was the idea that European settlers were chosen by God to expand westwards across America.
And that goes back to the U.S. Monroe Doctrine of 1823, in which the United States claimed a sphere of influence over the Western Hemisphere. So the United States has claimed a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere for much of its history, and President Trump makes us all confront that fact.
As with his America First slogan, much of Trump's thinking here is not new. But let's get back to what he's saying now about Greenland, Canada, and Panama.
Whether he's serious about the threats, is a question everybody is asking. But the very fact that he's making them, and generally not making annexationist threats outside the Western Hemisphere, with the very notable exception of Gaza, suggests that Trump recognizes the difference between U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere and perhaps its more limited interests overseas.
For some, this amounts to imperialist expansionism for the 21st century, like what many see in Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. Putin has illegally annexed parts of Ukraine and threatened much more. And Xi claims control not just of Taiwan, but of significant chunks of India. But with Trump, there is a twist.
With Trump, it's difficult to say he is he's an outright imperialist as Putin is, or as Xi Jinping has ambitions to be, because it's not necessarily a theory of imperialism that is driving that, but he sees Canada and Greenland as assets. I mean, this is a good asset that is in your neighborhood and that you should own, right? Across your street, you have a beautiful house. Well, why don't you try to buy it? And that's something that in Trump's history and business history, we've seen very often. He has tried to pitch to buy property that was not for sale. The crucial element here is the idea of deal making and the idea, well, if I want to get something and I can either get it through pressure or through incentives, I will do it, even if that breaks every rule in international relations and every relationship the United States has with its allies.
And sure enough, Trump's attitude to his sphere of influence risks America's relationships and reputation far beyond the Western Hemisphere. The rest of the world is watching.
At this moment, today, to me, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are the same. This bullying, I think, Trump has become Xi Jinping. So when the world sees that the two great powers of today, China and United States, are the same, they are not respecting rules-based order. They are pushing countries. For instance, Greenland may be taken over, or Canada, he wants it to be the 51st state, and so on. When the rules-based order is out, then what is the difference between China and the US?
And that brings us to the core of this spheres of influence idea and its disruptive potential. Because, as we've just heard, Donald Trump would not be its only subscriber. This is very much the worldview of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping.
Vladimir Putin has chosen to be obsessed with dominance over former Soviet periphery, particularly Belarus and Ukraine, that he views as part of the broader Russian nation.
I think China would welcome a carving up of the world into spheres of influence.
For his part, Trump has shown little interest in challenging either Russia's or China's claims to spheres of influence.
He doesn't understand why maintaining a sovereign, independent, prosperous Ukraine is in U.S. interest, and why the U.S. should throw blood and treasure on countering this revanchist imperialist agenda of Russia.
Trump himself has always shown relatively little interest in Taiwan. For Trump, Taiwan is really a chip to play in the larger U.S.-China relationship.
He is trying to move away semiconductor production to the United States to make the United States less dependent on Taiwan.
We've arrived at the, trillion-dollar question. If Trump wants a sphere of influence and doesn't mind Russia and China having their own, are these the makings of a deal of the century?
So an extreme version of what we could see if President Trump thoroughly applies spheres of influence thinking would be that the United States, China, and Russia explicitly or tacitly agree that they will have spheres of influence, that the United States would pull back from the spheres of influence that Russia and China claim. And so you would have, in this rather extreme scenario, a basis for considerable cooperation, or at least alignment, among the three major powers.
That could sound attractive for Trump, but what would it mean for everyone else, especially in those flashpoints most contested by the big three?
It would likely spell the end of Ukraine's independence and bring the Russian threat closer to Western Europe. Taiwan would quickly lose its autonomy, and China would take a significant step towards domination of Asia.
In its view, a key reason for why neighbors like Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and India are pushing back in their maritime and land disputes at China is because of the US's backing and the US's encouragement. So in the Chinese view, if the US retreats, these governments are more likely to adopt postures that are more accommodating.
Asian powers would be forced to respond.
The world is populated by middle powers and ascending middle powers like India that absolutely will not accept Chinese sphere of influence in northern Himalayas, particularly in the territories that India claims are Indian, or Chinese dominance in South Asia. Whatever Trump might agree to, these countries see themselves as poles in this multipolar order in their own right, and will deny other parties the sphere of influence.
So if it comes to India, I hope he doesn't break the trust, but if he does, India will survive. So we can take care of our defense, we can take care of our borders, we can take care of our seas, we can protect our trade.
And from Asia to Europe and the rest of the world, would the risk of conflict really go away?
This is a very dangerous world, because if the agreement is, we have this overlapping sphere of influence, and then the big parties can dictate the terms and the smaller countries have just to accept their fate, that opens the Pandora box for various type of regional conflicts between countries big and small.
That's just a taste of what this extreme scenario could entail. If Trump were to pursue it, he'd have to overcome significant pushback at home.
For him to, take dramatic actions to cede spheres of influence to Russia in Europe or to China in East Asia, I think would run into a huge amount of resistance in his own bureaucracy, in Congress, in the media. It would be a very difficult undertaking.
The entire region, a lot of things are happening.
It's also quite possible that Trump himself is unwilling to go that far.
Billions of dollars to support.
I think that if he believes that the US is entitled to own Greenland, to control the Panama Canal, or to include Canada as the 51st state, it doesn't necessarily mean that he will give his adversaries the same luxury of having the spheres of influence.
And to be sure, members of Trump's team have spoken of the need to divert resources from Europe towards the Indo-Pacific, suggesting the administration does want to defend its stake in Asia, so crucial for global trade. But there are also signals that they will demand that allies there do much more for their own defense, leaving options wide open for Trump to try some deal-making, while remaining below the extreme scenario we've just run through.
There's a more modest view of spheres of influence that might be more realistic and would have some upsides. Over Taiwan, President Trump could exchange public assurances with Xi Jinping to reaffirm the One China policy, maybe even go a little bit further to suggest that the United States doesn't want to see Taiwan become independent, that the United States would accept any peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences that would be reached without coercion.
Some indicators of this would be fewer arms sales to Taiwan, less public expressions of concern of Chinese coercion towards Taiwan.
Taiwan is scrambling to strengthen its precarious position, with promises it will spend more on its defense, and its chip giant TSMC agreeing a deal on the manufacturing plants known as fabs to try to get into Trump's good books.
So Taiwan has has been pretty anxious and has been feeling relatively uncertain about the direction of Trump's policy. We saw that TSMC made a major announcement of an investment of $100 billion in the US and plans to build more fabs in Arizona. So I think Taiwan is doing its best that it can to play the cards that it has, and we will see how the Trump administration responds.
That's the fear that's unfolding in both Asia and Europe, along the fault lines between the US, Russia, and China. That they could be sacrificed in a great power game before they've built up strength to defend themselves.
For the first time, the European and the Indo-Pacific theater, or just in general the global dimension of conflicts in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, is so interlinked. And now we see, through Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that the patterns are so similar and the concerns are so similar about what if he abandons Ukraine, will he abandon Taiwan, that all Indo-Pacific partners are watching very closely what's happening in Europe and vice versa. So the US allies in both theaters are actually on the same side now, concerned about what does it mean if the United States, which has purposefully built these alliance relationships, now suddenly leaves its allies out in the cold.
We're almost at the end of this video. We've worked through 3 strategies that might help explain Trump's actions. Realism, embracing power over principle. A reverse Kissinger, trying to pull Russia some distance away from China. And spheres of influence, a global carve-up for the ages. We've seen evidence that all of these ideas are playing some role. But is Trump equipped to see any of them through? 2 character traits could derail him. If bullying clouds his realism, and if his impulse to disrupt overwhelms his execution. Let's take bullying first. We've already heard about this concern.
Trump has become Xi Jinping.
If that view becomes widespread, it could bring unintended consequences.
If the two are the same, if the both are bullies, if both are pushing the boundaries of negotiation or rules in which they function, or both are untrustworthy, simply speaking, then out of the total of 193 countries, 120 have China as their biggest trading partner. If you were to realign yourself, you would naturally move to China.
As unintended consequences go, pushing 100+ countries closer to China would be a big one, especially if India were among them.
India would like to continue to work with the US, but if the US is going to become a China, then it's far better to engage with China and imagine a world where India and China are one market. Such kind of logic, it's not there in the government right now. I haven't heard about it yet. But imagine such a world. You created the EU, now look at India and China together. So I think these are the new options that will be on the table.
That's the thing. Countries everywhere will be putting new options on the table, things they might never have considered before. And that brings us to the second risk for Trump, his deep impulse for disruption.
I think Trump's his unpredictability, which he has achieved as he's wanted to, may prevent him from achieving any one of the very coherent scenarios that we've been discussing. He is happy to zig and zag, and often it seems as though tactical considerations, performative considerations are at the fore for him rather than a particular destination.
All three approaches might be true at the same time. Two of them might be true on Monday, and then the other two might be on Tuesday, and then there is another combination on Wednesday. Whatever it is, it's very risky, dangerous, and increasingly unpredictable.
That's the nature of disruption. It's a rolling of the dice, something that may run counter to the idea of strategy, but also presents opportunities for those ready to seize them.
In the totality of things, which takes domestic disruption as well as international disruption into account, I'm positively inclined. I think this disruption was necessary. The fake liberalism had to be called out. The extreme wokeism had to be called out. Europe had to be woken up. And the world at large, including India, had to be shaken into not being lulled into a strategic sleep. And I think Trump has done all of that. My only apprehension is that is he trustworthy? And at this moment, I don't know.
On the ashes of disruption, something new can be built. So for Europe, that means that for the first time, they actually have a real pressure to build up their own security and defense.
So we've got a sense of the strategies or combination of strategies that Trump might pursue, the goals and the pitfalls. And we've got a taste of the dramatic ways in which the rest of the world might respond. That is a measure of Trump's impact. But the thing is, he can't control the outcomes, nor can anyone else. A whole universe of potential unintended consequences.